Today, we're talking about a very little known part of California history, a group known as the Californio Lancers. They were actually named the 1st Battalion of Native Cavalry, and they were an Army unit recruited from among California's Mexican Californians to serve as soldiers in the Union Army during the time of the Civil War. They were called Lancers because they carried lances, just as the old leather jacket soldiers had on the frontier, and as the Californios had when they defeated American troops at the Battle of San Pasqual during the U.S.-Mexico War. Author Tom Prezelski, whom I'm speaking with today, has written a really informative book published by the University of Oklahoma Press about this unique group of soldiers, their actions, and the time in which they lived. Not only that, but their story also intersects with the broader history of the West, the history of Arizona, also Mexico, and of course, the history of the Civil War in the U.S. So settle in, and I really think and hope that you're going to enjoy my conversation with Tom Prezelski. Tom, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm wondering if, first of all, we're going to talk about your book, Californio Lancers, the 1st Battalion of Native Cavalry in the Far West.
All right.
And so, yeah, maybe we could start by talking a little bit about your background and who you are, and then, of course, what led you to write this book.
Well, as far as my background goes, I'm on my mother's side. I'm from a pioneer Arizona family with roots in Sonora. One of the things that got me interested in these guys in particular was that growing up, I got to meet a lot of cowboys who'd worked with my grandfather, and all the cowboys I met were Mexicans and Indians, but all the cowboys I saw on TV were not. And that always bothered me. So I was very interested. I got interested from a really early age, like 6, in trying to broadcast that history that is very neglected, especially in Arizona. And when I was in college, I took a class in Arizona history from a professor named Harwood Hinton, who's kind of got quite a reputation in Arizona, and his class was very popular. And one time in class, he just mentioned, just offhandedly, when we were talking about Civil War, he said, "Oh, and then there were these Mexican Lancers, California, who served in Tubac," and that was like it. And it's like after that, it's like, really, well, tell me more. And it turned out there wasn't much more. And I came to find out from folks at the Arizona Historical Society, Sidney Brinkerhoff specifically, that there'd only been a little bit of scholarship on the Native California Cavalry. Maybe there was more in California. It turned out there wasn't too much more, but that kind of motivated me to start this project. As far as my own background, I was a member of the Arizona State Legislature just as immigration issue was getting very ugly in Arizona. And it became clear to me at that time that people had a lot of misconceptions about who we were as a state, where we came from as a state, and who it was that built the state and who these families were. A lot of families who are still in Arizona, still very active in public life in Arizona, that they had roots that went back very far, still had connections in Sonora. And that was kind of what motivated me. I said, hey, just writing just straight history of this unit would actually be a political act. because I'm saying something that is breaking a lot of misconceptions about the history of the West, and who settled, and who was doing a lot of the work of kind of building our towns and cities, and trying to bring peace to the frontier.
I definitely think you could make the same kind of case about California and
Yeah.
California history. And of course, this touches directly on California history. Before we get into the topic a little bit more, the comment you made about your professor making an offhand remark about a certain aspect of history that you were like, wait a second. I think that happens. I think that's where these great research projects happen, is
Yeah.
either a footnote in an article or a book, or an offhand comment by someone that then takes you down the rabbit hole. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and it was quite a rabbit hole. I was not familiar with history of California. I think my only familiarity with history of California was at one point I got obsessed with the Catalan Volunteers. I was even in a reenactment group for the Catalan Volunteers, and so I had read a lot about Pedro Fages and about the early expeditions to settle California for the Spanish, and some of the kind of really fascinating relations with the natives in California. But that was so that gave me a few hints. Names would look familiar, and of course there's a connection, kind of some really offhand weird connections between like these people in the native cavalry and the Anza expedition, and of course we have a different view of the Anza expedition in Arizona, because it starts in Arizona and then they just kind of go to California. And meanwhile, in California, the history is there. They're very detailed about what happens as they go north towards San Francisco, which kind of brings me to another interesting aspect of writing this. If you're a history buff in Arizona, John Cremeny is a military officer. He's involved in Battle of Apache Pass and some of the early activity with the California Column. If you're from California, John Cremeny is this journalist and pal of Mark Twain and all this other stuff. So it's interesting seeing how it's some of these aspects. If you look at it from the California perspective, it's different than if you look at it from the Arizona perspective. And this story crosses over.
Yeah, I like that. Tell me. Well, then let's get straight into it. Can you talk a little bit about your book and who were the Californio Lancers?
Well, officially, they were the Native California Cavalry. We're the first battalion of Native Cavalry California Volunteers. And there was a state senator named Romualdo Pacheco who had conceived of, he'd had experience, I think, in the Mexican army prior to the American conquest. During the Civil War, he wanted a way for the Mexican American community in California to show its patriotism, show its support for the Union. So he proposed that there be a unit of cavalry organized in the Mexican community in California. There were a few other things going on. There was a very deliberate effort by the Republican forces in Mexico to whip up sympathy for the Republican cause when Mexico was invaded by the French, and then when they installed an emperor in Mexico. So there's that current going on too. Meanwhile, there's a lot of shifts in the Californio and kind of Mexican immigrant community in California. By this time, the Californios were actually outnumbered by Mexican immigrants, and both were outnumbered by, the immigrants from other parts of the United States. So there was a kind of a real kind of political effort to show some solidarity, and this was part of that. It took some time to recruit them. There were various problems in Southern California, for instance. And this is one of those frustrating things when you do historical research. All you could see was people talking about interference from Confederate sympathizers for the recruiting efforts. And I'm kind of picturing, someone setting up a table and a sign that says, join the Union Army, join the California Native Cavalry, and then, a bunch of, pro-Confederate bullies coming over and knocking over the table or whatever. But I never got any specifics as to what the interference was. But they basically got organized geographically. The first one was Jose Ramon Pico, whose name is all over the place, mostly in Southern California. Basically, the family name is all over the place. He seems to be the bad child in the family, but he organizes Company A in San Jose and kind of Central California. There's a Company B that's initially organized in San Francisco. It has all sorts of problems initially, but eventually they get a very good captain and a man named Porfirio Jimeno, who's probably the most interesting of the officers. He's a member of the De la Guerra family. And he writes these beautiful, very cynical letters during his service. And one thing I found out afterward, there's a professor in New Mexico who's writing a book about Mexican-American assimilation in the 19th century. And looked a lot at Porfirio Jimeno as kind of a case study. And it turns out Porfirio Jimeno was probably gay. There's some letters back and forth with William Tecumseh Sherman, who was very close with the De la Guerra family, where he just outright, he uses some interesting language to describe Jimeno. That's something I totally missed. I just saw him as kind of a guy who didn't quite fit in, but I'm really glad other people were doing research so we get that kind of full history. Company C was recruited in Santa Barbara from the De la Guerra family, and they get recruited within a matter of weeks. They have their 100 men together. They're camped out in what's now De la Guerra Plaza in Santa Barbara. There's some political issues because their captain was at one point a Confederate sympathizer, was definitely a Democrat, possibly at one point dabbled in sympathizing with the Confederacy, but they turn out to be one of the most well-disciplined companies, basically because most of them were cousins. And then there's Company D, which is in Los Angeles. That one has some of the most trouble with recruiting because Los Angeles was a center for Confederate sympathy. The thing that made them unusual, other than the fact that they were primarily Californios and Spanish-speaking immigrants from Mexico, primarily Sonora, but also because they were armed with lances. There was this notion that the Mexican soldiers in the Mexican War had been so effective with lances that maybe if we recruit a Mexican-American unit, we should give them lances. There's no evidence that these lances were ever actually used in combat. At one point, there is Company B is in the Central Valley around San Juan Bautista and the pass just beyond San Juan Bautista, and they're pursuing a gang of bandits. And no one ever talks about, okay, what were they doing? How did they pursue them or anything? But it's kind of fun to picture these Lancers pursuing these bandits across the Central Valley. And that may have been what happened. I mean, the newspaper accounts make of these guys a lot of the fact that they have lances. When they were pursuing Apaches in Arizona, they almost certainly weren't using their lances because John Cremeny actually writes a letter, says, hey, why are we sending these guys out with lances? We're going to try something else. But it seems very fanciful now, but in the context of the late 19th century, it didn't seem so weird. And you have to consider that lances were still being used effectively in European armies up until the 1920s. So it's not nearly as much of a throwback as it seems. It was a throwback in the United States, but it wouldn't have been a throwback elsewhere. So a lot gets made of that. And when I was initially doing my research, people would say, "Hey, did they really carry lances?" And I said, "Yeah." And I don't know if there's any surviving lances in California, but I know there are at least 2 in Arizona. There's one that was found in the Santa Cruz River, south of Tucson, that was identified as a native cavalry lance. They have a very distinctive design. And then there's one that ended up in the Historical Society collection that came from someone in California. But they definitely did carry lances.
So I seem to recall that was one of the points at the Battle of San Pasqual, where they did very well with lances against U.S., I guess, infantry and Marines and sailors. And I guess that was part of the reason. My question is, were these lances that they're using, you know, in service, are these lances that are manufactured by the U.S. government now?
Yes. I think it was General McClellan had been an observer at the in the Crimean War at the and had witnessed lances being used very effectively in Crimea. And I mean, contrary to that one battle, but and so he came back to the United States and proposed this design for an American lance, which was based mostly on an Austrian design, and it was basically, it was actually really weird and modern. It was made specifically so that you could fence with it. So if you got in a battle with someone who had a saber, it would be protected. The shaft would be protected from saber blows and that sort of thing. It's rather aggressive engineering, and it's got a counterweight on the rear end, so it can be carried very easily. And of course, the big thing that gets noted in some of the newspaper accounts is that brilliant red pennon, which is mostly decorative, but there was actually at one point a practical purpose for having it, which is kind of gruesome, which is the pennon would actually wick up blood if you got into a battle, and that way the lance wouldn't become too slick to operate. Of course, these guys never actually used them in battle, but there was a supply of lances at the Benicia Arsenal that had been manufactured in California.
So, well, we'll get into the part about them using them or not using them in battle. And now it's just personal curiosity, but were they expected to use their own knowledge or in utilizing a lance, or was there a U.S. Army lance doctrine that they were trained in? How did that work, or do you know?
There was, I can't remember which edition of the U.S. Army drill book it was, but there was one that had lance drill. And I don't know. I mean, a lot of these guys were vaqueros, had been vaqueros prior to the war, but also a lot of them. There's like one guy who lists his occupation as gambler. I'm wondering about that. There's people who are musicians, list their occupation as musicians. There's store clerks, a wide range of occupations, which tells you a lot about frontier California, which is that, we have the stereotypes of what the role of Mexicans were in frontier California, but these guys have all the jobs that other people have, but most of them are vaqueros. So, and So it stands to reason that those vaqueros were able to train, or at least help the training of the other men who may not have been as familiar with horses. I don't know if they actually used the lance drill. It does seem that they, from newspaper accounts, they were using the lances in parade. Like parades were really important, especially in Southern California. They would frequently just make these demonstrations in Southern California because, like, especially around the 1860, I think it's around the 1864 election, they just kind of ride a circuit around the Los Angeles area and do a parade in each town just to make sure that everybody knows that the Union is watching them. And so they definitely did some kind of drill with the lance. It's just not clear how much training they really had with them.
So these guys are organized. The book title says 1863 to 1866.
Mm-hmm.
How concerned were the authorities in California about the Civil War and its extending all the way into the West, if possible?
Okay,
but then eventually they were sent to Arizona, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
When did that happen, and why did that happen?
Okay, that happens. Well, they first start talking about it toward the end of the Civil War, by like late winter, early spring in this, when the war is still going, of 1865, for various reasons that you'll have to read about in the book because they get very complicated. They aren't able to bring the whole battalion together until the summer of 1865, by which time the war officially is over. But officially, the war, in some ways, the war is over. I mean, you know, the Confederate Army has surrendered at Appomattox, but the recruitment is continuing, especially in the West. Troops are still deployed in the East Coast. The troops are still deployed in the South for reconstruction duty. So it's very the war is still on in the minds of the military planners. And of course, the important thing is that the war is still going on in Sonora and Mexico. And that's why they're sent to Arizona. There's kind of two things going on. Number one, they need more soldiers in Arizona to fight the Apaches. The original group of California volunteers have all been discharged. They've had their 3-year enlistments, so they need to grab up any soldiers they can and send them to Arizona to fight the Apaches. General Mason is planning a massive campaign against the Apaches. The other thing, of course, is that the French have invaded Sonora, and because the French have invaded Sonora, the imperialists are able to take over Sonora. They're able to kick out the Republican government that was in Sonora. The governor of Sonora, his army has been completely broken. Him and his one of his officers, who is a guy by the name of Ronstadt, by the way, that's it's very important if you're from Tucson. So Governor Pesquera and Colonel Ronstadt are fleeing into Arizona. They actually arrive in Arizona at the same time the native cavalry does. And so Ronstadt, Frederick Ronstadt, and Governor Pesquera kind of set up, while the native cavalry are coming in and kind of setting up what becomes known as Fort Mason. The Colonel Ronstadt and Governor Pesquera are setting up kind of a ad hoc capital of Sonora in Arizona. So they're actually in the United States running a Mexican government at a place called Calabasas. which is still which is now part of Tumacacori National Monument, or sorry, National Park. And so the Native Cavalry gets there, and I guess a lot of activity is slowed down because that's they arrived in the middle of what is kind of the high malaria season in Arizona. And obviously in Arizona, you have to locate your post where there's water. And back in those days, the only places where there were water were basically swamps, and they were a lot of flies and other insects that carry things like malarial fever and typhoid and stuff. And of course, they weren't used to this at all. There were some other soldiers there from Sonora who just fared this just fine, but the folks from California did not do so well. So there's this period of maybe a month or two where nearly all the soldiers are sick. Now, while this is happening, some of the soldiers who weren't so sick were actually sent into Sonora because soldiers who had deserted en route were rumored to have been captured by the imperialist army and held at Magdalena. And this is like one of the strangest stories in the whole Native Cavalry saga. The Company A and B, the ones who are well enough, are sent down there basically to recover these deserters. They confront the Imperial Army. And well, number one, when I say Imperial Army, there's some wonderful description of what these guys were, and they were not. They seem to have been like these conscripts who, without uniforms and with they were armed with muskets and stuff, but still, they were the Imperial Army. And there's this confrontation where Captain Pico basically is trying to start a war, or apparently is trying to start a war, and someone talks him down, and eventually he returns home. But on the way home, he accidentally shoots himself in the foot while pursuing what he thought were Apaches. And bear in mind, he's supposed to be the greatest horseman in all of California. He fell off his horse, accidentally shot himself in the foot, and then he ends up spending the rest of his time in Arizona convalescing, either in Tubac or Tucson. And at one point, there's this account of him being taken back to California by one of the regular supply wagons that comes into Arizona, and he doesn't ultimately he doesn't serve the whole time with his company. And eventually he does. When he dies, I think it's like 1909 or something, they mention he died because of an infected foot, and I always kind of wonder if that goes back to this incident, or if it's another incident where he was wounded at the Battle of San Pasqual when he was a very young man.
So did they then? They did wind up having also campaigns against the Apaches, you mentioned.
Yes, they were. At one point, it's January of 1866, and which kind of tells you a little bit about what the state of their morale was, because the Civil War was over. The Sonora, for the most part, was no longer an issue. It was getting to be under Republican control, so there wasn't a threat coming from there. And also, they were on 3-year enlistments, and so they were all anxious to go home and get discharged. General Mason, however, wanted to do this campaign, and there actually is an incident. There are a few incidents where there's a mine. I don't know how much listeners are familiar with Arizona history. There's a mine near a town called Arivaca, called Cerro Colorado, and apparently that was attacked by Apaches, and the the folks at Cerro Colorado sent a message to Fort Mason saying, "Hey, we need some help here," and Major Cremini, who at that point was in charge of the post, just said, "Hey, no, we can't spare any men. Too many people are sick. We don't have enough weapons, and General Mason wants to send us out to fight Apaches, to fight Cochise, in east of the post." So anyway, there's this massive campaign which would have worked under slightly different circumstances. Basically, General Mason's idea was to have troops basically marching kind of a circuit around what is now Cochise County, and to keep the Apaches constantly in motion and eventually exhaust them and force them to surrender and presumably be placed on a reservation, which is a strategy that worked under General Crook 20 years later. But Mason did not have the resources that Crook did in terms of like a communications infrastructure or anything like that. He just had the native California Cavalry and some other California volunteer units, and strangely enough, some volunteer units from New Mexico. At one point, they actually crossed paths with the volunteer units from New Mexico. So they're marching. It's Captain Jimeno. I think it's Captain Jimeno, and I don't remember the other one. Jimeno is leading a detachment of native cavalry, and I mentioned him specifically because he kept a journal of where he was going. It's a bit of a mess. The first thing they have to do is they have to find their scouts. Their scouts never reported to Fort Mason, so they actually have to go into Sonora, to a town called Santa Cruz, and find their scouts. They know their scouts are like hanging out in Santa Cruz, and I picture this kind of very cinematic picture of Captain Jimeno walking into a bar and saying, "You're supposed to be our scout. Come with us." So they find these. They get their two scouts, who are both, I believe, are both kind of assimilated Opata Indians. I don't remember their names, but they turn up over and over again. And they go across what's now called the Sulphur Springs Valley to the Chiricahuas, and then to Fort Bowie in the Chiricahua Mountains. Fort Bowie, of course, was established by the California Volunteers a few years earlier. At this point, it was basically kind of these rock hovels in the mountainside. It was not a pleasant place to be, and they discovered that Fort Bowie actually did not have enough food for the soldiers. They were waiting on a shipment of food, so they go south along the Chiricahua Mountains towards Sonora, and they happen to meet the supply wagon that has all the food, and they end up escorting the supply wagon. It gets to be a mess, but they find sign of the Apaches. Porfirio Jimeno actually does confront a group of Apaches at what's now called the Wilcox Playa, a big dry lake bed in what's now Cochise County, and he pursues the Apaches all the way to the Dragoon Mountains at what's now called the Cochise Stronghold, and then they kind of disperse after that. One thing that becomes clear, in addition to this campaign being really disorganized, is that the Apaches are already leaving. Cochise is already just packing up and leaving Arizona, going to Sonora, where he thinks he's going to be safer. And though in the end, General Mason and General McDowell take a lot of credit for driving the Apaches out of Arizona, if you look at the full historical record, what's going on in Sonora as well as Arizona, it's pretty clear that the Apaches were leaving. And they weren't pursuing them, they were just following them. Uh, and we definitely know they were not carrying lances in this campaign because Major Cremeny mentions it in a letter where he says when they went out on campaign, they exhausted the entire supply of firearms that was being kept at Fort Mason. So they clearly turned in their lances and picked up rifles or carbines before they went out.
So there's clearly a time when Lancers is just sort of a ceremonial title.
Yeah.
Who were these men who were recruited, and how did they go about recruiting them? I mean, what kind of incentives were they given to join?
Well, definitely for companies C and D, there was a lot of economic. There were a lot of economic issues. There were kind of during the Civil War era in Southern California. There were kind of three big disasters that occurred. There was floods, there was a smallpox outbreak, and then there was a drought. And I may have them in the wrong order, but they were all in rapid succession. And especially the ranches were in really bad shape. And of course, the vaqueros were either itinerant or they were kind of almost serfs in some of the ranches, depending on like their own personal circumstances. And I think a lot of especially the vaqueros and people in general, because the economy was hit as a whole, they just didn't have any work. And I know this is precisely, there's actually a mention of this when they're talking about the recruitment of Company C, when there's mention of it in the newspapers, that basically the De La Guerra family in particular was hit really hard by the drought, and their vaqueros had no work, and so it was very. I'm not sure if, I mean, given kind of the almost kind of paternal power that the De La Guerra family had in Santa Barbara at that point, if they were just ordering their vaqueros to, oh, you're joining the army now, and they said okay, or if it was, hey, we're not going to be able to pay you, but you can join the army. I don't know how that worked. Because you look at it kind of like in terms of when there's like a civil war in Sonora, all the vaqueros work for the hacendado as soldiers, and then when the conflict is over, they go back to herding cows.
Right.
So I don't know if that was the dynamic that was going on, or if it was that these people were actually volunteering because that was an option for them. Company A was a little different because there was actually some patriotic fervor involved, because Captain Pico was such a powerful political figure in San Jose, and he had given this very patriotic speech, which is, of course, it's in the book, but it was off printed in the papers. And Company B was weirder. I'm pretty sure a lot of that was economic. Some of it was patriotic, but initially, there were a lot of French folks joining Company B. A lot of them deserted.
I saw that group of French soldiers.
Yeah, but that gets weirder. Okay, so you have these Frenchmen who join. Most of them desert. I'm pretty sure it's because of the politics. You even have them. There's a detachment that's sent to Angel Island. I'm not sure exactly what they did on Angel Island. I take it they did something about maintaining the battery there or something. But they actually tried to desert Angel Island. It's like, how do you desert from Angel Island? So right. I actually found an account of someone who deserted Angel Island well, not a native cavalry soldier, but he actually swam to Tiburon.
Wow.
And apparently he had done this multiple times, and at one point he actually drowned in the process. So, yeah, so there are different places, different motives. But eventually, when Captain Jimeno takes over, after I think there's almost complete turnover in the company. There's only a handful of people who are from the initial group that's recruited. Captain Jimeno starts recruiting more kind of Latin American immigrants, Californios, and I don't know exactly what their motives were, but it transforms the company. However, this is the weird part. Right toward the very end, shortly before they leave California to go to Arizona, there's a group of French surnamed soldiers who are all recruited all at once. And I think they may even be signing up in Los Angeles from barracks. But it turns out that these are people who deserted the French army.
In Sonora, in Mexico?
In Mexico, yeah. I don't know if they were actually from Sonora, but they were. There's actually mention of these guys were in there, and they're listing their birthplaces like Algiers, and in one case, one of the soldiers may actually be African. I mean, like, because they list them as being dark complected and stuff. So this was a truly interracial unit, because you had Native Americans and Mexican Americans, Anglos, and then at least one African.
Do you know anything about that, now that you mention it, anything about the Native Americans who participated and why they might have?
Well, I think, I mean, you've had shows about this. The notion of ethnicity in frontier California is really complicated. I think some of them just basically considered themselves Mexicans, and some of them are from the mission tribes, who are in a lot of ways what they call the mission tribes. They wouldn't use this term now, but they are kind of assimilated into Mexican culture in a lot of ways, though they do maintain their own cultural identity. There's a lot of Yaquis. The Yaquis, of course, initially came to California during the gold rush from Sonora because they were already in the mining industry in Sonora. So they had skills that they could bring into California. So there are quite a few Yaquis. And of course, it's hard to break them out because they don't list the ethnicity. They just list, complexion. And then, oh, this guy's from this one village in Sonora that's largely Yaqui, so he might be Yaqui. And of course, the Yaquis have a complicated history as far as like their cultural identity, because they assimilated into Mexican culture entirely on their terms. So, again, they're not going to be, to an Anglo-American, they're not going to be distinguishable from other Mexicans, but in their interactions with other Mexicans and Mexican Americans, people are going to know, and people are going to recognize like little linguistic things and that sort of thing. But yeah, so they are there, and so again, it's a very racially mixed unit. One of the things that's interesting is when you go through the pension documents, there's at least one soldier where there's like a little note in the pension documents and documentation that says, this man is an Indian. Are we supposed to be giving him a pension? And of course, he gets the ruling from higher up is, yeah, he served in the army. It doesn't matter if he's an Indian.
Wow.
Yeah, so remarkably progressive attitude but it's Reconstruction era, so there's a lot of that going on.
I would just reading excerpts from Antonio Coronel's times in the gold fields in Alta California, or in California, and he mentions Sonorans. There were a lot of Sonorans. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes when those Sonorans are mentioned, they could have been Yaquis. Is that
Some of them, yeah. I mean, there's even some place names in like the Gold Country. There's like Yaqui Creek and that sort of
Oh,
thing. So, yeah. And I used to work for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, and there's a small Yaqui community to this day in Fresno. I don't know if it dates back that
hmm.
far, but the presence, and of course, in Arizona, we have a rather colorful and complicated history with the Yaqui tribe and the different communities that are located basically between Tucson and Phoenix, and then of course their heartland is in Sonora. Now the complicated part is in Sonora, the Yaquis were supporting Maximilian for very complicated reasons.
Interesting. So then, was was Spanish mainly the language used, or I guess since they had very few officers, it would have been English in terms of their training and commands, etc.
Most of the officers were bilingual. Even the ones who were Anglo were bilingual. Cremini spoke Spanish fluently, and he was known to be really. Major Cremini was the second battalion commander for the native cavalry. He spoke both English and Spanish fluently. Most of the officers spoke English and Spanish. There is one officer, at least one officer, Lieutenant Soto. They say he barely speaks English. So there's some controversy over, well, should we have officers that can't speak English? But of course, um, even like there's one of the De La Guerras, there's a Lieutenant De La Guerra. He is said to really speak poor English, but they concede that because of the kind of the power the De La Guerra family has in Santa Barbara, there's no way they could have anybody who wasn't a member of the family in the chain of command. So that's one of the concessions they make. But most of the officers speak both English and Spanish. Could we talk a little bit about their first battalion commander?
Please,
Yeah,
please.
their first battalion commander was Salvador Vallejo. And if you've heard of Salvador Vallejo's brother, but haven't heard of Salvador, there's good reason for that, apparently. Mariano Vallejo was, famous for being very smart and cultured and this great kind of diplomat as well as a political leader. By the time the Native Cavalry is organized, I think he's already in his 60s. So they don't turn to him to take any role in the battalion. Instead, they talk to his brother, Salvador Vallejo. Salvador is his younger brother, has extensive military experience as a militia officer, both in California and under the United States. And supposedly, one of the accounts of him is that in his numerous campaigns against various tribal folks in California, he had broken nearly every bone in his body. That was that was almost like a qualification. Well, he's been injured more times than anyone else. He turns out to be everything that his brother wasn't. He's like known to be rude. Uh, a lot of women just don't like him. They stay away from him. In fact, I think Mariano Vallejo and his wife actually had a dispute, and his wife did not want Salvador Vallejo living on the property. Mariano insisted, so she went away for a while, and he was just apparently just a really foul guy and was not very good at doing his duties as major of the battalion. There's a lot of paperwork that just wasn't being done. He had apparently, I'm not going to say commissioned, but he had appointed some officers and nobody knew where they were. And they were never they're not on the rolls or anything. It's like, oh, no, I appointed this guy to do recruiting out there. And then people get confused about who's supposed to be doing the recruiting. So he was eventually forced out, and then he writes, or rather, I think he narrates a kind of a memoir, I think, to Bancroft. And when they ask him about the native cavalry, he says, "Well, I felt I had to do something to help the Union, the cause of the Union, because that's the only thing that stands between." It was something along the lines of, "It's the only thing that stands between democracy and Republican government in the Western Hemisphere and the tyranny of the European powers." So obviously, he's looking at the whole conflict in Mexico, and he even says, "I don't care about the African Americans. They're irrelevant. It's about preserving democracy and Republican government." But then he says, "But I'm not going to say anything else." He doesn't give any accounts of what he did as commander of Native Cavalry. He just says, "I felt I had to do it, and that's it."
Yeah, that would make, well, if that was how his command went, the way you described it, makes sense, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
How did the unit dress? What were they? Did they have regular uniforms?
Unfortunately, they did. Apparently, yeah.
Unfortunately,
I was hoping. There's a book that a friend of mine wrote in Texas about the Mexican American Union units in Texas. They also had. I mean, he thinks they may have been Lancers as well, although there's no definite proof of this. But he has on the cover a photo of one of the. I think he's a corporal in one of these Texas units, and he's wearing just a standard Union cavalry uniform, but he has a sombrero, and it's like, oh, that's great. I hope I have evidence that that's the way these guys are dressed, but I'm thinking the fact that I don't have evidence either way about their uniforms is an indication that they just wore the same uniforms that everyone else did. There's even like some when Captain Pico is in the Humboldt district, there's even just some throwaway comment about them throwing their caps in the air, and it's like, oh, they just had the same caps that the other soldiers had. Although I'm pretty sure that most of the California Volunteers wore the Hardy hat without any decoration on it, just as a good practical wide-brimmed hat. And I think that's probably how they dressed.
so how was the unit eventually disbanded or closed down? It was a pretty brief time, it seems, that they were in existence.
Yeah, they. I'm sorry, I'm running low on power here. They just had the 3-year window that all the volunteer units had, and I think their enlistments all expired in March of 1866. So it was just kind of standard bureaucratic stuff. They march out of Arizona. One of the companies, and I'm not entirely sure why, actually gets on ocean going. Well, they get on at Yuma. They get on a steamer, and then they get on an ocean going steamer around the Gulf of California and get dropped off, I think, in Los Angeles, and then they march to back to Santa Barbara and have a parade. But the other units, they just come back. Apparently, their uniforms were in a really bad state because there are accounts of them getting their final settlement on their salaries and all just rushing to clothing stores. So it's probably the same story you see repeated with a lot of the California volunteer units, especially. They just come back. The only ones who get any special recognition are Company C in Santa Barbara because, of course, of the influence of the De La Guerra family. and that these people were so such a big part of that community. That unit is very much about Santa Barbara to an extent that the others are not about their places they're from.
Just to wrap up, because I know you're running low on power.
Yeah.
Is there any place that we can go, either in California, Arizona, or elsewhere? Any museum exhibits, any monuments to this unit?
I know there's a guy in San Jose who's been trying to get the graves memorialized. He's located a few of the graves. He located Pico's grave in San Jose. So those exist. I know at the De La Guerra House, they in Santa Barbara, they had an exhibit about them at one point, and they may do that again. Other than that, Drum Barracks in Los Angeles has a little bit. To me, the best place to go is in Tubac, where they in Arizona, where they actually have one of the native cavalry lances on display. And I took issue with the interpretation, and I think they've corrected it since then. So yeah, there's really not, again, yeah, these guys are unfortunately largely forgotten. The California volunteers in general are kind of forgotten, but these guys in particular, I think because they kind of come in the middle of the war, they don't really have a lot of colorful stuff that they're doing. And then I think, California, and, of course, this is something you're fighting against. California has and Arizona as well, they has a very kind of dismissive view of its own history. And people are very much wanting to move on and make progress rather than look back. And there's some virtue in that, but also it means that some of these very colorful stories that are important to who we are get forgotten.
I agree. Well, hopefully this will help. Your book and this interview and so on will help memorialize these companies, this battalion, a little bit more. And I do think it's an important part of the history of the West. And I'm glad I learned about it. I'm glad I got to talk to you. Tom Prezelski, do you have any other projects going on right now?
I'm researching a book about one of the territorial legislatures in Arizona. Probably not something that interests you necessarily, but the weird connection with the native cavalry is when I was doing the research, one of the big issues was everyone has trouble getting to the Capitol during the 1885 session. And there's actually a newspaper account saying, this is the worst winter since 1865-66. And I'm thinking, oh, wait a minute. That's when the native cavalry was in Arizona, and it gave them a lot of problems then. So it's like, okay, I know about this. So, yeah.
Well, we'll look forward to it. I'm sure there'll be interesting information in there, especially if it ties into the native cavalry.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating. And once again, a little plug for the book, Californio Lancers, the 1st Battalion of Native Cavalry in the Far West, 1863 to 1866, by Tom Prezelski.
Yeah, University of Oklahoma Press.
That's right, University of Oklahoma Press. I mean, they do some great things about California history and Western history in general.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.